Churchill, he called ultra as the code word for all this intelligence coming out of Enigma, the goose that laid the golden eggs. And I think the fact that he was such a fan of intelligence, whereas Stalin ignored the absolute welter of evidence that Hitler was about to invade.
Without ultra, the Germans are going to get away with a lot more surprise. Yeah. We don't see the Battle of the Bulge.
Yes.
So we see two Panzer Corps coming from the east aren't even picked up.
Germany still loses the war?
Maybe, but as Hinsley said, 2-4 years delay. We can't see a nuclear device being used in Europe. It's outside our imagination, but it's possible.
Yes.
If we hadn't cracked ultra, we'd still be working on it. I mean, that's the point.
Throughout the Second World War, Nazi Germany had a special weapon in its arsenal. Not a powerful bomb, tank or missile, but a cipher used to encrypt and decrypt strategic communications. Enigma. For years, it helped run the German war machine, allowing them to carry out devastating U-boat attacks, air raids and troop movements. The best part? It was deemed unbreakable. Yet unbeknownst to Nazi high command, the code had been cracked. First, on an earlier machine by a Polish mathematician in 1932, but after Germany's invasion in 1939, this was secretly passed to the British to finish the job. And they did. A small group of mathematicians and engineers gave the Allies an invaluable window into Hitler's decision-making. Many believe, at the very least, the breakthrough shortened the war on the way to an Allied victory. So what if Enigma had never been solved? I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether those split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, we unravel the breaking of the Enigma code. Just how decisive was the breakthrough by the Allies? How many lives did it save? And did it truly alter the course of the war? These are, of course, questions for our experts. And joining me today, as ever, the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel once again, the historian and journalist Nigel Jones. Welcome to you both. Now, we have in front of us a map that we have used before on the channel. Those who've seen our Battle of the Atlantic episode might recognise it. This is the Atlantic theatre in World War II and essentially the whole battle. But before we get to the map, Chris Parry, I'm going to start with you. It's kind of in the name, really. Enigma was fiendishly complicated. What actually is it and how did it work in layman's terms?
Essentially, it's a typewriter that initiates a number of electrical impulses that go through various byways within the machine to complicate all sorts of code-breaking efforts. So, for example, if you press a key, it comes up as another key on the end of the process. And as long as you have the code books and the sequencing at both ends, both the transmitting end and the receiving end, you can actually use this machine. And I think people have seen what it looks like, and you've seen it in
There's
submarines.
one right behind me in this studio.
Indeed. But the interesting thing is, it had been around since 1918. It had been commercially available in the 1920s. And in the 1930s, people started to say, we need to have a look at this to see how it works. And in fact, the pioneering work was done by the Poles, led by a brilliant mathematician called Marian Radewski. We saw it in the Spanish Civil War in a primitive form. So the French were able to get hold of a number of machines that the Germans themselves were using. And by the time of the Second World War, the Germans had incorporated it in practically every level of their decision-making and also their distribution network. But the key way it worked, very simply, is if you pressed a button, it went through a series of rotors, which each had the alphabet on, A through to Z. But every time it went through a rotor, it turned once. And if you added a plug board at the front, this is what the Navy insisted on, and you can see on the thing behind you, that's got a plug board. You actually got up to something like 150 billion combinations that were enabled by the machine. And the Germans said, Vorsprung technique, it's unbreakable. Nice. But the Poles have been at it. They've been able to break down how the machine worked. They were able to decode basic messages. They passed that information on to the French. And of course, as the Germans moved westward, So did the expertise and the personnel. What is not known is we had a team of about a dozen Spanish Republican exiles actually working on it as well. And so after the Spanish Civil War, we were able to get ahead of the game. And right at the start of the Second World War, in fact, well before the start of the Second World War, the government started bringing in people who were experts. There's a chap called Dilly Knox, for example, Dilwyn Knox. He was a papyrologist. That was his speciality. And he brought together a whole load of sort of mathematicians, even before Alan Turing entered the scene, to see, look, what can we do in relation to this? And then, of course, the whole thing picked up with Bletchley Park, and we go into the Second World War.
I know, Nigel, welcome back to History Undone. I know the Germans, as Chris said, thought it was unbreakable. But as he mentions there, it was commercially available in the 1930s. The Poles cracked it in 1939, earlier version. Alan Turing gets some of the way in 1940, more of the way in 1941. It seems remarkable that the Germans, it was commercially available for so long and they never thought that it was being cracked. It was a top secret operation.
I think that's probably because Enigma was so sophisticated and so complicated for laymen, at least, not necessarily for cryptanalysts, that they had excess confidence in it. But we mentioned Dilly Knox. We had a pool of expertise dating from the First World War, and Chris will be very pleased about this because the Navy was the service that had specialised in this in the Admiralty, Room 40, in the First World War. And some of the scientists who, for example, cracked the Zinman telegram, which
Dilly Knox himself was involved, of course.
Indeed he was, which brought America largely into the First World War, were still operating 20 years later and were brought in to Bletchley Park. And the head of the Secret Service, the Foreign Secret Service, MI6, SIS, another Navy man, Rear Admiral Hugh Sinclair, bought an estate in Buckinghamshire, Bletchley Park, specifically to house the code-breaking, code-cracking unit, which he foresaw. And he did this just before the First World War. I think he did it before the Second World War broke out in, I think, September 1939, because he foresaw what a huge part cryptanalysis and code-breaking would be in the new war.
Fergus, I think the key point about the machine is, in itself, it's useless. If you're trying to break code, what you need is the daily settings and also the code books that go with it. And until you can actually figure that out, remembering all the combinations, or if you can get hold of some of these code books and settings, that's the key issue here. Everybody thinks it's the machine. There are lots of them flying around. There's no question about that. But unless you can get the daily settings, which did change daily at midnight, then this was useless to you.
Yes.
Well, Nigel said it was very important, probably nowhere more so than at the Atlantic Theatre of War. I know you're very excited always about this map, Chris. Talk us through how it was maybe used in the Atlantic, and also, kind of ironically, there's a key moment which actually led to it being broken.
Yes, I mean, right at the start of the naval war in the Atlantic, the Germans are actually on the front foot. Their intelligence and signals intelligence organisation, BDenst, has actually got hold of a number of our naval codes. So it's got the auxiliary code, and by 1941, it's also got the administrative code. It's got naval ciphers 1, 2 and 3, which are successive ones we've introduced. And more importantly, it's got the U-boat disposition signal. So it actually knows where we think their U-boats are. So it's quite difficult. Now, the key issue in the Battle of the Atlantic, of course, is avoiding U-boats and also surface raiders. So it's quite important to try and deal with this. And frankly, our cryptographers struggle. They have to rely very much on trying to guess what are in these signals. And you do it, it's called a crib. You try and guess what certain words are likely to be. So the front end might be weather signal, for example. The end might be Heil Hitler. And so once you crack that, it's fine. What made it even worse is the Kriegsmarine actually used very short words to actually transmit a lot of information. So instead of saying sunset today was, they simply have a simple three-letter word in German. So, the Kriegsmarine weren't silly about this.
So they're not, because we've all seen The Imitation Game. That's kind of where a lot of this story was popularised for modern audiences. that the Heil Hitler is crucial in that, but that's not happening as much in the Atlantic.
No, it's happening. I mean, there are some messages, particularly when Bismarck is pursued, for example, where Lutyens puts it on the end every time. But you're in the business of trying to guess what is there. What is critical about Enigma is it never, ever changes an E, for example, to an E. It never changes a T to a T. It always changes. So you can see within the message where things are repeating themselves but not actually being transcribed into their own selves. But what happens is that you get a situation in May 1941, HMS Bulldog actually brings a U-boat to the surface, and for the first time they managed to get hold of some of the settings documents and also some of the coding.
U-110.
U-110, well done. Yeah, OK. So that is absolutely critical to them actually starting to be able to read 40% probably of the messages. It's simply a question of time to actually decrypt. So if you start at midnight, it takes you an hour and a half probably to actually set it up. You're never going to get more than 40% in the time available. So time is quite important. So that's the first breakthrough. Now, the problem in the Atlantic is the Germans put a fourth rotor on. And in 1942, they have an absolute field day. They sink 7.8 million tonnes, including half of that off the American coast after Pearl Harbor. And we've got a bit of a problem. And then the first lieutenant of HMS Petard, a chap called Lieutenant Fassen, he goes with one of his seamen into another U-boat and says, right, I've got all the documents. Gives it to a canteen assistant who's in his teens, goes back for more. They get the machine itself, which they use a machine gun to get off the desk. Give it to the canteen assistant, submarine sinks, and both the guys are trapped in the submarine.
And perhaps fortuitous is the wrong word, Nigel, but I was talking to Chris before we started the show, and because Germans in the German Navy, they were under orders, if they were captured, to throw the machines overboard, and they even used dissolving ink on the paper.
Indeed. I think as well, it's worth making the point that the weakness of Enigma and the code encrypting system was that it depended to a large degree on the signature on the individual operators. And they sometimes were careless, and that showed up in the... So it wasn't an infallible system. It did depend on the human factor. And when the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park realised this was a key to cracking the whole system as well, that it wasn't completely
The other thing
infallible.
is, if you sent a message twice, for example, in two different encryptions with the same keys, you had a method of working out what the settings were and what the code was.
And would that just be human error?
No, I mean, that would simply be, I don't know if that one went. It's like with an email now. If you're not sure it goes, you send it twice. And that's what a lot of German operators did. In fact, with Lorenz, which is the very top secret strategic system, that was cracked entirely by a 4,000 character message being sent twice, because you could compare and contrast this, on the same settings.
And it starts to making a difference. The Allies have, once they've cracked it, it makes a real difference in the Atlantic because it allows them to get past the wolf packs.
Well, it allows routing. I mean, I think it's overemphasised, to tell you the truth. Where it does make a difference is after that fourth rotor is added. You see a marked drop in sinkings. You see an increase in the sinking of U-boats between January and May 1943, where Dönitz says, right, we're not doing this for a while because we're not getting this right. In fact, Dönitz has a conversation with his chief of staff and says, look, is it possible that they've cracked Enigma? and they go away, they have an investigation. The chief of staff comes back and says, the only people who can probably be giving this away is you and me, because I've investigated everybody else, so it might be us.
Interestingly, when the secret of Ultra and Enigma and Bletchley Park was revealed, as we know, was it 40 years after?
It was
74.
74.
Yeah, in 74. I think Dönitz was still alive.
He was.
And couldn't believe,
Yes.
because his whole life's work would have been undermined, that the codes had actually been cracked. It came as a horrendous shock to the old boy in the evening of his years.
Because we're going to talk as well about North Africa in a second. But that was one of the key things for the Allies. They couldn't act on every piece of information they got right to not raise suspicion.
Because, yes, exactly. You get the horrible dilemma. For example, we probably knew that the Germans were going to raid Coventry, the mass raid on Coventry, but the population couldn't be evacuated and warned about it because that would give away the fact that the codes had been broken.
I mean, I think the other interesting thing is we're not sure whether Barbarossa was forecast. We knew it was going to happen. We told Stalin it was going to happen. I've never actually seen... The real problem we've got with Enigma and ultra decrypts, of course, is that Churchill, when the war ended, said destroy everything. All the documents, all the basic decrypts, all the bomb machines, which we can talk about later, they were destroyed and dismantled. So everything was swept away. Happily, people didn't do it very efficiently. And you go to Bletchley today, there's actually quite a lot of the decrypts there. And of course, a recreation of the bomb machines that were required. I mean, the key thing about the bomb machines, they were set up famously by Turing to actually go through all the combinations that were possible on the key settings. That's the point, not the actual coding itself, but the key settings that might be in place. And it's an amazing piece of engineering. I wonder if we could actually make one like that today.
Yeah.
And there were
it's always mentioned as the birthplace of modern computing.
But it's not a computer. That's the key point. It's not a computer.
Mechanical.
Yeah, it's a mechanical combination setter. And there were 200 of them. People think it was a single machine. It wasn't. It was that. And later on, of course, you get the Colossus machine and the Robinson machine, which are computers, and they're designed to crack the Lorentz code, which had 12 rotors in its system. So infinitely greater number of combinations. Yeah.
I think we should say as well something about the numbers working at Bletchley Park, because at the beginning, I think there were about 150 in all, bottle washers as well as top flight scientists from Oxbridge. And they were simply overwhelmed at the beginning with the amount of traffic coming from all theatres and all our enemies. And Turing actually, and a couple of his top scientists who were with him, sent a message to Churchill personally to say, we need more bods, we need more hands on deck, this is all too much. And Churchill sent one of his famous Action This Day messages saying, give them everything they want, literally in those words. He sent it to Pug Ismay, his right-hand military man, and they were. And by the end of the war, from about 150, in Bletchley Park itself and all the outstations, there were about 8,000 people. So that's some indication.
And it's a very good point, because I think I'm right in saying that when the US came in on the side of the Allies, the British shared sort of ultra with them, and then they made their own a bit quicker and more efficient, but they have much more bodies working on it.
You could say that's the beginning of today's Five Eyes intelligence system.
Yeah. I think it's worth mentioning that the Soviets had also cracked it as well.
I thought you might mention this.
So that, we're not telling the Soviets that we've got Enigma, and they're not telling us they've got it. But certainly ahead of Kursk, we're giving them information that come from ultra decrypts, and they're sitting back, if you look at the records now, and going, we know.
Yeah. Their machines must be different to...
No, they just got people who's
John Cairncross, one of the Cambridge Five, was working at Bletchley Park and betraying Bletchley Park secrets to the Soviets.
No question about that. But they are working on it themselves, the other side of the Urals as well. So, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, one thing about the Battle of the Atlantic, I think the issue is we still would have won it because we brought in lots of innovations. Now, the other thing that people never mention is what we call high-frequency direction finding, which is absolutely critical to finding out where U-boats are. Admiral Dönitz made a big mistake in saying every evening you've got to send me your fuel, your torpedo loadings, and also the weather. Every U-boat had to do that. So as soon as they started transmitting, they were being picked up by ships and also by land stations. They're saying, right, we've got a U-boat there. And so that didn't help at all. And the other thing was that all the innovation came in, sonar got better, Lee lights, aviation, hedgehog, squid, all these things came about and would have come about. Yeah. We just would have lost more merchant shipping. We've got to remember that with Enigma, 17 out of 20 convoys did not see a U-boat, which is a pretty staggering statistic if you think about it. And so with Enigma, that's the case. We have lost more. There's no question that it would have taken longer. And I think probably when we go to various theatres like North Africa and also to D-Day later, Enigma gives you confidence that you can actually take the risk in these situations.
Well, let's leave the Atlantic and go to those theatres now. Time to change maps and move to the North African theatre of war. OK, welcome back. We have our favourite map of Europe circa 1940 in front of us, but crucially, it also has the North African coastline, which is what we're going to be talking about in this section. Nigel, we mentioned the Atlantic in the previous section. Where and sort of what moments does breaking Enigma become most useful in North Africa?
It becomes most useful in the North African campaign. Indeed, this was the only land campaign after the fall of France that British Empire troops were first engaged in. At the beginning, it was the Italians operating from their colony Libya against Egypt, which was a British colony, to speak, so hitting eastwards into Egypt. And they suffered a very heavy defeat in, I think, December 1940, Chris might correct me there, Sidi Barrani. Thousands and thousands of them trooped into captivity. And Hitler at that point realised that he would have to reinforce his failing Italian ally, and he sent famously the Africa Corps under his probably best tactical general, Erwin Rommel. And so the North African campaign opened, and the goal of the Germans was to capture the Suez Canal, the only gateway to the Far East, the English Empire, the British Empire there. And that became a vital campaign that we had to hold Egypt, we had to hold the Suez Canal against the Africa Corps, against the Germans. And eventually, after several swings of fortune, the campaign going one way first and then the other, eventually Rommel was put on the back foot at El Alamein in October 1942, and that was, as Churchill said, the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end.
Indeed. And we know all about that, Chris. El Alamein was one of our first ever episodes of the show.
That's right.
So how crucial is Enigma to that? Because before that, of course, Rommel was having quite a bit of success here.
Yeah, I mean, what's quite interesting, if you look at the logs of the decrypts at that time, what we have cracked is the Italian Enigma. That's the key point. And that's where Dilly Knox actually did a great deal of work with it. His team, they were known as Dilly's Fillies, because they're mostly women. So the Italian one is giving us most of the information at this stage. But towards the end, we've cracked both the Luftwaffe Enigma, very important in terms of close air support and also other things here, but also the German Army Enigma as well. And what we're picking up very much is the supply routes from Italy to North Africa in terms of ammunition, oil, troops and things like that. That enables all the strike aircraft from Malta to be able to intercept these convoys. And also it gives, obviously, Montgomery the confidence to say, look, I know how much logistics he's not getting. So I know where I actually have to put the pinch points on the battle. And so I think the whole campaign hinges on the fact, not so much we can see what Rommel's decision-making is, but the whole basis for supporting his campaign is known to us. That's the point, and we're able to interdict it.
You said the influence in the Atlantic of Ultra is perhaps a little overblown. Would you say the same thing in North Africa?
I think at the critical point of the El Alamein build-up and campaign, it's absolutely critical because it's enabled us to actually destroy quite a lot of what is coming. In some ways, Rommel has to commit to action at that point because he's actually running out of fuel and ammunition and things like that. So he's almost saying, look, if I don't do it now, I'm going to be on the back foot. Yeah. So I think that's the key point. I think we think that the ultra decrypts are an all-seeing eye. They're not. No. We've got to realise we're just seeing part of it. I think, from what I can see from the logs, you're only seeing about 40% of messages. So you've got to deduce from the rest of it what it is you want to see. But there's no doubt the critical point of the campaign, Rommel's whole logistic network is laid bare. And we're able to interdict it. That's the key point. I should mention there's an earlier real success for Enigma at the Battle of Cape Matapan, where Admiral Cunningham destroys essentially an Italian cruiser and destroyer fleet. And that is certainly cued by breaking the Italian Enigma.
And we said in the previous section, Nigel, that Dönitz almost gets a whiff of Enigma. Yeah. Is anyone at all suspicious or aware on record during this
It
campaign.
sounds extraordinary that they weren't, but as I said, I think that the Germans have got this reputation for efficiency and cold-eyed determination, and they probably believed their own propaganda and did not think that... Probably they thought, if they have cracked Enigma, then we're for it. You know, we're going to lose.
I mean, the key point is the machine itself it gives you a false illusion of security. Unless you know you've lost the daily settings and the key codes and this, that and the other, you're not going to get any suspicion that this machine is in any way sort of compromised. And of course, in fact, when one of the U-boats was intercepted and the machine came off, they actually kept the ship at sea deliberately, so the sailors couldn't go ashore and say, "You never guess what we've just done." So there's real careful sort of counter-intelligence here. And Churchill famously would restrict the number of people who knew about Ultra. There's no issue about that.
OK, there's another sort of theatre that this links to, because perhaps without the success in North Africa, this would have severely impacted D-Day.
Indeed. And perhaps Enigma is the forgotten factor in D-Day, because most accounts of the D-Day campaign concentrate on the agents that fooled the Germans into thinking that we weren't going to attack Normandy, that we were going to attack anywhere else from Scandinavia to the south of France. Whereas, in fact, our signals intelligence was picking up virtually all German signals intelligence in Normandy, the actual target of D-Day. So there was hardly any German intelligence that we didn't know about in that campaign. And I've just been reading a book by the current historian at Bletchley Park, David Kenyon, which makes exactly this point, that not only Enigma, but the whole of Bletchley Park's intelligence had in fact cracked the German defences. So despite the Atlantic Wall, I think ultimately the Normandy campaign was lost by the Germans before it had even begun.
Is it too extreme to say that D-Day would not have taken place without Ultra?
It still was going to take place. I say, if you hadn't had Ultra for the remaining part of the war, D-Day probably wouldn't have happened in 1944. That's the key point. I think it's probably 1 or 2 years later. Harry Hinsley famously said, you know, he's the historian, if you like, of all this. He said, you know, I think it would have delayed the end of the war by 2, maybe 4 years.
And that's now the prevailing.
And maybe the result would have been different anyway. So I think it would have happened. You'd have taken a lot more casualties. I mean, the key point that Ultra reveals is where the German formations are. You can see that you can take the risk down there. That's the key point, because they've moved up here and they're inland, and you know what Rommel's plan is.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's not necessarily that D-Day even would have struggled without it. It's like you might not even attempt it, right? If you don't have all that logistics and planning.
Nice to say.
And so, you know, that's critical. So we knew where a lot of the targets were for bombing beforehand, for sabotage by the Macphee. And as I said, you know, the fact is we knew they'd been deflected away from Cherbourg, except for one general, Eric Marks, who said, that's where they're going to come. They're going to come on a Sunday. He actually said it. It's quite extraordinary.
And they came on a Tuesday.
Yeah, that's right.
And he was killed 6 weeks later anyway.
He was, yeah. Interestingly, in the Falklands War, we captured material of Argentine coding in the submarine we captured at South Georgia. So people never learn, do they?
And who was involved in that, Chris?
I hesitate to say.
Just quickly, briefly, before we move on to the Undone, are we saying then that without Enigma, besides, as I said, that prevailing narrative that it may have, the war may have been delayed by 2 years, does it fundamentally alter the course of the war besides that?
Yeah, I think it does, because you don't have the confidence to actually say, I can land in North Africa or I can land here. I mean, famously, the Dieppe raid took place in a real vacuum of ultra intelligence, and it was a complete fiasco, as you know. And look at what happened in Norway before we had Ultra. Again, we failed at a time when the German intelligence, BDINS, did incredibly well, actually, to decode what we were doing. And so you can see in areas where we didn't have that information advantage, the risks were greater. There's no question we'd have taken more casualties. And the Americans would have said, well, actually, do we really know what the risk is here? Are we going to risk all these troops and resources? I'm not sure.
And one factor we haven't mentioned at all, of course, is that it wasn't only the Germans or the Italians that we were concentrating on. There were huts at Bletchley Park that were concentrating on the Japanese as well. So we haven't mentioned that aspect of the war in which intelligence was a vital thing.
But of course, they didn't have Enigma and
No.
a totally different coding system in many ways, actually, not just an alphabet and language. It was totally different. They didn't go in for Enigma in the way that the Germans did.
True.
Yeah.
Well, we may touch on them slightly in our next section because that is the real history around the breaking of the Enigma code. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, time to get into what we love doing here in History Undone and ask ourselves some long-term questions if the Enigma code had never been broken. I want to start with the Polish, because that, for me, might be the first counterfactual. If that doesn't happen, they don't pass this on to the British. Do the Allies ever get going?
Well, the Poles definitely give us a lead-in into this, and they give us quite a lot. I think we've got to remember, as Nigel said earlier, there's a lot of work going on from the First World War onwards. Dilly Knox and his people and things like that, they're looking at Enigma already by that stage. I think the real catalyst is, if you don't have the Poles in the scene, is the Spanish Civil War. Because there are machines that come out of the German and the Italian side. You see an interest being taken by the intelligence organisations in France and in Britain at this stage. The French start leading this after that. Afterwards, as we mentioned earlier, you've got Spanish cryptanalysts involved. The French are well down the curve. Without the Poles, it becomes more difficult because they've done an awful lot of work. And Radetzky and his team are brought into the system as well. So you've got continuity throughout. So it becomes more difficult. So you do get to start to unravel it, possibly a bit later than you would have done before. Depends on the resources you put in.
Worth mentioning that there were an awful lot of ideologically committed Europeans in countries that had been occupied or had fallen to fascism, who were very ideologically committed to making sure that the Germans did lose the war. I mean, we knew that the Poles had Enigma. We even sent a delegation to Poland, but by that time, the Poles had taken their Enigma cracking secrets to Romania.
Yeah, on the way out.
On the way out.
And the French did the same, of course. It's interesting what you say there, Nigel, because Franco, the only time he actually exits the Iberian Peninsula after the Spanish Civil War, he goes to meet Mussolini. And he goes through the south of France here, and he's booed all the way by ex-Spanish Republicans. and he says, I'm not doing that again.
And of course, we mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union are also, they have their own version in the background. Surely there's a counterfactual then that the Allies perhaps don't crack Enigma, the Soviets still do.
Yeah, I mean, you've got an interesting situation. As we said earlier, you've got John Cairncross, who's in Bletchley.
Yes, especially with a whole army of ideologically motivated left-wingers, communists and others in Germany and in Britain, everywhere, who are ideologically committed to communism and certainly against fascism.
But here's the thing, John Cairncross hasn't got anything to give the Soviets if we haven't got Enigma. I mean, I think there is an issue here whereby, again, Enigma gives the Americans confidence to say, we're going to do Europe, we do Germany first. And I think, in my view, Enigma sustains their confidence to keep on Germany first.
I would agree with that.
Even when it's going badly, they're going, OK, we're still going to stick in there through 1942, when in fact in the Pacific it's pretty hectic there as well at the same time. Guadalcanal, Midway, Coral Sea and all that sort of thing. So I think...
Especially if shipping is being sunk in the Atlantic. In this scenario.
And as you say, during Operation Drumbeat on the East Coast, they lose 4 million tonnes of shipping in 1942 alone. And so there's a confidence issue again here. And I think that's the real value of being able to have this sort of system, is to say, if we're seeing nothing, we really can't pitch in here.
This was my thought, Nigel. Does the US completely abandon Germany first and just focus on the Pacific?
That could have been so, because their interests were much more obviously, especially after Pearl Harbor, immediately in the Pacific. Europe was a long way away. There was a lot of anti-Allied feeling in America, which had kept the US out of the war until Pearl Harbor anyway. So I think that would have been the temptation for them, certainly.
I mean, if you're saying to your allies, look, I'm seeing some of the enemy communications here, and you're sharing it with somebody, there is a mutual confidence here that you have to you have to acknowledge, and that's the key point. And again, as a military person, if you can minimise the risks in any theatre, whether it's operational or a tactical theatre, then resources don't get wasted. That's the key point, and you can have a two-theatre war.
So you touched on it in the Atlantic. You said in this scenario, you're saying Britain probably isn't starved out of the war. Some ships are still coming through.
I think it makes it still, even without Ultra. I mean,
but Europe is looking pretty isolated.
Yes, it is. Yeah. I mean, interestingly enough, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff going on here. So Germany is protecting those ships coming from Canada and America that are bringing grain into Spain, for example, to stop it starving. I mean, you've got all sorts of anomalies going on here. My view is that, you know, the Atlantic would have needed a lot more resources. We'd have probably had to get into aviation a lot quicker. Here's the thing. I think you would have found Coastal Command would have been boosted at the expense of Bomber Command. I think that is the key issue relating to Enigma, is the bombing campaign from the British point of view, and possibly even the American, would have been subordinated to actually getting it covered in the Atlantic.
Crucial too is that the man at the top had so much trust in intelligence. Churchill, you know, he called Enigma, Ultra, as the code word for all this intelligence coming out of Enigma, and Lawrence, he called it the goose that laid the golden eggs. And I think the fact that he was such a fan of intelligence, whereas Stalin ignored the absolute welter of evidence that Hitler was about to invade, that was a crucial difference, and again illustrates the importance of, without getting into the great man view of history, of personality at the top. I think
by the time of Kursk, he's got over that, Stalin, to tell the truth. Nigel, he's starting to
better late than never.
Yeah, that's right. I think he's got over it by then, and he does take. You know, when Zhukov says to him, "Look, I think we know what's going on here."
Yeah.
I mean, the key thing is, Fergus. You know, I think an Ultra decrypt said that Barbarossa was going to happen, and we warned the Russians.
Yes.
And in fact, they just ignored it.
Yeah.
And of course, what Churchill wasn't prepared to say to Stalin is, look, we've got Enigma. And Stalin, of course, in return, wasn't saying, well, we've got it too.
Indeed.
OK, so then in this scenario, you have an America that is perhaps a little more Pacific first. You have the Soviet Union, who have cracked Enigma, and they're still fighting with Germany. Where is Germany looking now? We've covered a lot recently of going sort of this route. Yeah, where's Germany looking to in this scenario?
Well, the trouble with Germany's intelligence operations is that their main military intelligence, the Abwehr, was absolutely honeycombed with, in Nazi terms, traitors, with anti-Nazis. And so, unlike, say, MI6 or OSS, the forerunners of the CIA, there were ideological Germans who were committed to Hitler not winning the war.
Including the head of the Abwehr, Canaris.
Canaris, indeed. Canaris and Oster, his deputy.
Yeah.
It was absolutely honeycombed.
Yeah. So no, I think without Ultra, the Germans are going to get away with a lot more surprise if they want to put it in place. You're going to have to put a lot more reconnaissance, a lot more SIGINT, a lot more resources into trying to see what happens. I mean, one of the ironies, of course, is we don't see the Battle of the Bulge.
Yes.
So we see two Panzer Corps coming from the east aren't even picked up on Ultra. And so when the Battle of the Bulge happens, there's a question, why didn't we see that?
So for the second time in the war, in 1940, when the Germans went through Ardennes in Sichelschnitt, and then again in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, we didn't see either of them coming.
And what's really interesting in modern terms here, Fergus, is if you can't get into modern crypto systems, you're going to have to devote an awful lot more to physical surveillance, whether it's satellites, whether it's aircraft, drones, for example, electronic intelligence. So this is where you will have seen a huge growth, and quite a lot of the resources that were used for bombing, used for fighter aircraft, would have been used for reconnaissance instead. So I think that's the downside of not having Enigma, is you're going to have to put an awful lot into reconnaissance.
Germany still loses the war?
Maybe, but as Hensley said, 2-4 years delay.
Yeah. The post-war borders are looking different.
Everybody could have been exhausted. Germany could have said, well, actually, we'll just stop, please, and we'll fight the Russians, but we're not going to fight you. because you haven't landed on
Do you
the...
think
Whether the Allies would agree to, the Western Allies would agree to that, of course, is another question.
Would you have dared land? That's the
Indeed.
point, without the intelligence. That's the key point.
So what are we talking?
Churchill was dubious. Let's not forget about D-Day right up until D-Day happened, and even afterwards, because of his fears of landing on an enemy-held coast.
That's right. So, you know, if you're holding off the Western Allies, you've got a problem with Italy because they've come through North Africa, of course. But, you know, the Germans made a real fist of holding Italy here. You could have held here. And you could have said, well, we're just not playing, actually, and we'll hold the Russians.
Hold the Russians, but then how does... So what you get is almost like a stalemate or a negotiated peace on this side, and then...
No, you simply say, well, we'll hold here too. And as long as you're not landing here, we're not really worried about the Ruhr and the short route to the Rhine, are we?
So I think the war would definitely have lasted longer, maybe a year.
Well,
that sounds like entrenched from what you're talking about.
But there is another factor, and it always rears its ugly head, of course, is Manhattan comes to Europe rather than to Japan. That may be the issue. Is that
Berlin is obliterated?
Yeah, or something token. Yeah, absolutely. Stuttgart maybe, or Leipzig.
So you think that might be the only way the US come to Europe, just by dropping the bomb? They would never. They never put troops on the ground in Europe.
If you don't have the sort of intelligence you're getting from Ultra, you're taking very much the same risk you're going to take with Japan if you invade.
Yes.
Heavily fortified, very densely populated. And you're going to have to put a lot of troops on the ground.
Losses, yeah.
Yeah. So it's maybe that. I mean, we can't see a nuclear device being used in Europe. It's outside our imagination, but it's possible at the outside.
I want to come back and expand slightly, leaving the Second World War. We talked about it earlier. Ultra is, sometimes seen as the birthplace of modern computing. Does that change anything at all? I suspect not, because as we said, the US, when they were given Ultra, they made their own one a bit quicker than the British. Does it change at all how we emerge, like technologically, from
if we hadn't cracked Ultra, we'd still be working on it. I mean, that's the point.
That's nice.
All this sort of thing would still have been going on, even if we hadn't. Actually, the amount of resources devoted to it, I wonder if it had been the same as you say.
Yeah. Do the technological advances we see in the mid-20th century slow?
Yes. I think we haven't talked enough about Alan Turing because he was the one undoubted genius working there. I once interviewed a historian called Lord Asa Briggs, who'd been at Bletchley Park, and he said, we all deferred to Turing, even when he turned up still wearing his pyjama bottoms because he'd forgotten to put on his trousers, because we knew he was a genius.
But I think also, Nigel, it's worth bearing in mind there were a load of geniuses there.
Yeah, he was a supreme. He was
in charge and was seen to be in charge. That was the key point, and showed the leadership required. But as you say, Briggs was there. We had a whole load of...
Roy Jenkins was there.
A whole load of people from Oxford and Cambridge who weren't cryptanalysts. As I said, Dilly Knox was a papyrologist.
And he really didn't become famous until the 21st century,
because of the secrecy of it.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
I think we've got to stress, yet again, how much has disappeared, Fergus. I mean, the history of Bletchley Park and Enigma Ultra is really conditioned by what was destroyed at the end of the war. There's no question about that. But what we see is a tip of the iceberg. I think we know why they were destroyed. Two reasons. One was secrecy. The other thing is it covers up for Churchill's mistakes, of course. So you knew that and you did nothing.
And isn't it remarkable that of all the thousands of people at Bletchley, they all kept stum. They all kept their mouths shut until the 1970s. That is amazing.
So I think we are saying then, had the Allies not cracked the Enigma code, well, that's the Western Allies that we're talking about. Probably America would not have pursued Germany first. They'd have kept their eyes on the Pacific. They may not even ever enter Europe at all. The Soviet Union, having cracked it themselves, will still fight Germany. What does Germany do? Does it push on here? Most likely not. We might end up with an almost entrenched warfare, a stasis, with Germany just fighting the Soviet Union on its Eastern Front. What happens then? Does the US then come into the war to drop the bomb on Berlin? And leaving the war into the second half of the 20th century, do we still see those miraculous technological advances with computing that we saw in our timeline? Some questions to dwell upon. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Nigel Jones for joining me. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.